Kia ora, and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. This is your boy Diggity Doo Dog, Mr. Peptide Panther, Mr. Slippers, here with the Wobbly Wildcard for another episode of the Niche Cast, and we are just gonna talk about some Kiwi sporting matters as we always do, no matter what's going on in the world, and we're still in that weird old time where I would say shit's hitting the fan, but it's not hitting the fan. But it's a very strange vibe, isn't it, Wildcard? How go thee?
Yeah, I'm alright. It's certainly a strange time, but I'm just sort of getting by day as per usual. At this point, I've got absolutely no idea what days mean. Sunday is as good as a Monday, is as good as a Tuesday, is as good as a Friday. Like, they all seem the exact same to me. But, sometimes I also do look at the old date, like the actual date, the April whatever, and I think, like, oh, we're only that far through the old lockdown period. It's still a little while to go. And then other times, like, an hour later, I'll look at it and be like, you know what? We're way further into this thing than I thought. We're actually almost done. Like, it's, I don't know, it's a weird thing of perspective, but yeah, just, rolling through them one by one. Bit of a blow yesterday when old mate John Prine died, though. That was a bit of a rough one. There are some great songwriters out there on the planet. There are some I would even say are as good as John Prine, but there are none better than John Prine. So, R.I.P. to John Prine. Stephen Hayden, the music journalist, I think, the dude, ex-Grantland fellow, I think he summed it up on a tweet better than anyone. He said John Prine had his genius was the ability to be both the funniest guy in the room and also the saddest guy in the room, sometimes at the exact same time. So, yeah, that was a bit of a stink one. Been pumping out the tunes in honor of that fella lately, but other than that, just same old.
Same old. Yeah, apparently it's one of those Christian holidays coming up this weekend, and it's like, oh, who cares? Like, it's I definitely agree. The days are blurring together in a beautiful fashion. Where you also makes you wonder about the old calendar and the importance and relevance, depending on your perspective, of the modern calendar. It's an interesting time because usually when I look at dates, and you're kind of saying, depending on your situation, it's either going by really fast or really slow, and I've always got this feeling like, oh shit, we're already at this stage of the year. But it's kind of funny because it doesn't matter, because you're doing that from a competitive standpoint. It's like, oh shit, we're already this far through 2020, and I haven't done anything, but all these other people have done shit, and it's like, nah, everyone's just like in the same position. So it's kind of good, because then you don't have that angst or anxiety of how fast things are moving, because it doesn't matter. Like, it literally doesn't matter right now. The fact that we're already in April, and it literally to me feels like I am still in like September or August of last year.
I mean, it shows how much these things are like social constructs, eh? Like the dates and the things that we all go by the exact same calendar, and it's necessary so that we're all on the same page when things are working normally, but as soon as things aren't working normally, like, all those things just, it's crazy how quickly they just evaporate into, like, meaninglessness. It's like, yeah, the calendar's actually not really that important right now. Like, if anything, the way we count days should be like the old scraping the tally charts on the prison wall. That should be how we're counting days, if anything.
For damn sure. I just know that I've finished all of the Narcos series, so it was a bit of a bummer to finish it all and be like, what's next? Because then after I finished the Mexico series, I went in to watch El Chapo, which is another series on Netflix, and it's just like just completely different and not appealing at all. Primarily because I was using the Narcos as like some of my Spanish practice, so it was good to have legit Spanish and the Colombian Spanish and the Mexican Spanish and spotting the difference, and then trying to tie it up to the little subtitles. And then I go to watch El Chapo, and it's like, from the first, like, I watched half an episode and it was just like all in English, and I was like, well, it's convenient and all, but it doesn't have the same same vibe, same feeling I got from watching Narcos. And I have this weird thing when I'm like, that's why I don't like recommending shows to people, because of my own personal experience. Like, I don't like being recommended shows to me. Like, as I've explained to you, like, I just watch whatever tickles my taste buds at that time, and it's a feeling, it's a vibe, and so I don't want to recommend stuff to other people because I know what it feels like to have stuff recommended to me, and then watching it and it's just like, this doesn't appeal to me at all. So, but part of that was like, part of the reason I got so into the Narcos was it's good from my opinion, but then there's also like this, it's especially the Escobar stuff. It connects with me. There's a mystique and all that stuff, and it's a lot of that stuff hits my soul. I can feel it in my soul, which is really difficult to explain. But just a brief observation from the Narcos stuff, it's fairly interesting, and I've got I don't mean to celebrate myself, but I've got a fair amount of knowledge about international narcos operations and criminal underbellies and stuff like that. It always interests and fascinates me. And so learning about the Escobar, so the Escobar situation, it's like, well, that was a crazy period, and learning that a lot of these countries and a lot of these situations, they like, how are you able to do that? And it's like, well, you look throughout that country's history, in this case Colombia, that shit has happened. Like, they've had civil wars, they've had all of that stuff is ingrained in their culture. So you grow up and it's like, it's nothing to you, where for us in New Zealand, we don't have a history of violence. So it's like, well, I can't shoot someone in the head. Like, I can't decapitate someone. Like, it's not within me to do it. But so that was an interesting observation. But then there's a clear, and maybe this is why I preferred the Escobar section over the Mexican section, although they were both quite interesting. And it's because the Escobar thing, now I don't doubt that Colombia's criminal underbelly stopped. Like, it's definitely there, it's everywhere. But the Escobar period, like, it was like an era. The Cali cartel and the Escobar Medellin cartel, that was an era in Colombia's history. Whereas the Mexico stuff has just increased in bullshit to where we are now. Like, I watch another YouTube channel with this, like, a real life dude reporting live from the front lines of Mexico, telling people what's happening in Mexico, and that's happening today. And it's like, well, so the stuff from the Narcos Mexico series has only escalated to this point. So it's like ongoing. It hasn't stopped. And if anything, it's got 3,000 million times worse than what you're watching from the Narcos Mexico stuff. So it's like, on the one hand, you got Escobar, who had a start and stop period. Whereas the Mexican stuff, like even the Cali cartel, like, there's probably offshoots of both Escobar and the Cali cartel in existence now. But the portrayal in Narcos was like, that's a period of Colombia's history, and that's a period of just time there. Whereas the Narcos Mexican thing was like, that's how it started, and well, it's all got worse since then. So it's like, I found that interesting, and I enjoyed the Narcos Mexico thing, but it just tempered my viewing experience a little bit, knowing that nothing has changed for the better, and it's all got worse since that kind of period that is documented.
Yeah, on a similar sort of note like that, I sort of have the same feelings when it comes to a lot of kind of historical shows. You know, like, it's when they make them when it's an ongoing thing, it's just not the same, because you don't have the perspective of being able to say, here's how it started, and okay, maybe it didn't so much end, but we can at least draw a line in the era at this point, sort of thing. And those shows tend to be more interesting because they have something to say about it, whereas the other ones just tend to feel a bit more exploitative when it's about something that's ongoing. Or in this case, I haven't watched Narcos, so I can't really comment on that. There is a fantastic 30 for 30 documentary called The Two Escobars, which is about how Pablo Escobar sort of had this, it's about him, and it's also about that other fella called Escobar, who was a football player for the national team, Colombia. They went to the World Cup in '94. He scored an own goal that got them knocked out, and then he was like caught up in then murdered on the streets. So back in Colombia, like a month later or something like that. But it's about that in these two corresponding stories. But it's also about just like the influence that Pablo Escobar had all over, even regular society, which in its way sort of ties into what I won't call it a binge show, because it's not a show you should ever binge, because like on the front thing of the DVD box set it has two big words that say listen carefully, like you got to watch it slowly or you just get lost. But the show I have been working my way through recently during lockdown, which is The Wire, which is a similar kind of thing. Like I'm just up to a point where they're showing how the Barksdale crew has sort of like got all these legitimate fronts and things to launder the money and all this, and you know, stringer bells off at night classes learning economics, you know, and they're starting to chase up money and find ways in which it connects to politicians and political donations, and just the entire, there was a thing they keep saying is like, you follow the drugs, you get drug dealers, you get junkies, you follow the money, you don't know where it's going to go. So there's probably a little bit of a crossover there between your lockdown series and my own one. I've watched it all before, but I'm only about, I think I'm 9 episodes through season 1 as we speak. Trying to get through 1 a day. I don't really want to push it to maybe 2 if I've got a bit of extra time. Maybe 3. I haven't done that yet, but I definitely don't want to be sitting there like churning through them all. A, because it'll just eat up all my time, and B, because I'll get lost and not appreciate it. But yeah. So what's next for you after Narcos is done? Then have you anointed a successor?
My intention is to rewatch the Escobar series, but
yeah, fair enough.
But do it in a.
I'm rewatching a show, so I can't speak.
Like maybe just the 1 episode a day, just so I can take that in that way, because I was churning through like 3 or 4 episodes in the afternoon every day, and it's amazing, because there's the thing that happens. And obviously it happens for anyone in any show that they're watching, where you're part of that world, and you're part of that little fantasy reality that has been created. And if you watch, I reckon there's a threshold. Like if you watch more than 2 episodes back to back to back to back to back, your realities start to get blurred. So last episode we were talking about like coming out of like maybe a meditative state, which can happen through, you know, any activity, and then realize, oh shit, we're still in this lockdown thing. Oh shit, like there's still this COVID-19 virus happening around the world. It's still happening. That would be when I would awake from my blurred reality of being a fly on the wall in the Colombian jungle, and snapping back into reality. So I think there's a little threshold, and maybe that's a good activity, just watching one at a time to let it soak all in. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's just like I got so down buzzed when it finished, because immediately after watching the Narcos Mexico, which is the more recent series of Narcos or version, I went into like the other similar shows, and they just don't, in no way, shape, or form do they like capture me the same way. Like there's an Escobar like film on Netflix, which was just like half as good as the Narcos stuff. You watch one, like I watch a lot of YouTube, so shout out to this guy, OG Shadow Official. That's his YouTube channel, OG Shadow Official. He's given like the real life updates of what's happening in Mexico right now, so you can go stuff like that. But then even watching, like, you watch one interview with the DEA agents who are in Colombia, and you don't need to watch any more. Like, you get the whole gist just from one interview, and they do like international tours, speaking and stuff like that. So there's plenty of interviews with them. So it's like there's you get to a point where you just want more and more information. You want more and more insights, and that more and more of that drug, which is the connection to like whatever art you're consuming, you're consuming that art because it has that connection with your soul. It touches you as a person, and that's the drug, is that feeling and that connection. And so when something finishes and nothing else gives you that connection, that it's like give me more, I want more. So it's just it's a weird spot. But nothing's on the agenda. Probably doing a bit more useful shit with my time is probably on the agenda. But yeah, I do want to tap back into the just observing the Escobar stuff, and I think just how those, and then there's probably the way Escobar was such a powerful figure for his community, and that tension and balance between the terrible and the brilliant. It's not just like good and bad. It's like there are people who have both extremes in their being. And sure, you might only get to the good stuff because you want to perpetuate the bad stuff, and it's like both forces balance things out. But your actions, when your actions stem from the extreme of good and the extreme of bad, makes for a very interesting dynamic within a single person. Like that, I think that's what interests me about a lot of these folks who get involved in this type of stuff.
And a realistic dynamic too, because like that, yeah, that's talking about it in the absolute extreme. But like even just everyday people, everyone's got a bit of good, a bit of bad, a bit of this and a bit of that in them, right? So like no one is uniquely perfect or uniquely terrible, no matter what they've done or thought or said or whatever, all those kind of things. Yeah, I mean that kind of like, because when I watched The Irishman. And part of it was talking to you about it for a while, I remember as well. Like, when I watched The Irishman, I chased up all I could find to read on the internet, articles about the movie, articles about people who lived through it or knew people, like interviews on podcasts, all these kind of things. Didn't get around to reading actual books because I had other books to read. I didn't go quite that far, but like just chasing up stuff on the Jimmy Hoffa thing, just trying to fill in the blanks. And also it was just such an interesting kind of like intellectual quest. First of all, just finding because it was based on a real story, finding out what happened, but also like chasing up the different threads, and like different people from different aspects of that story had different opinions on what happened and different recollections. So there were bits where it clashed, bits where I could see, oh, okay, right, so the movie took this liberty in order to tell the story better, but then other ways in which it's like, oh, well, did this actually happen, or did this like actual... Sometimes you can tell where it diverged from reality, and sometimes it's just a straight up clash where it's like, well, we don't even know which story is the real story here. So I found that kind of aspect of the actual storytelling and the memories of people involved who either aren't alive anymore to speak for themselves or are extremely old and unable to speak for themselves from that matter as well. Like, it was a story set several years ago, 60s, I think. When did Jimmy Hoffa disappear? Probably late 70s, but that was after he'd been in prison and sort of faded away a bit. So, yeah. And then that in a way is like, because then other times I'll just watch a movie or something which is just 2 hours in and out. When it finishes, it's told me all it needs to say, fictional story or whatever. I tend to prefer those kind of things because you get sort of like what we're talking about before with like historical narratives and stuff. With that kind of thing, with just a fictional story that starts where it means to start, ends where it means to end, and those characters aren't real, they didn't go on to do other complicated things or anything like that, so the entirety of the movie is the entirety of the sort of artistic offering. There is a sort of like, I mean, you can always watch the movie again, you can do that, but there's also a sort of like, oh, I kind of want to know what happened to those people though. Like, it's fun to think about, it's fun to imagine, but there's also this sort of like, it's like a release because the movie's done, but you also don't want to release it. Like, there's a reluctance to leave that world, sort of thing, which is probably part of like the psychological reasons why those things blend in a little bit when you do get binging on shows like that and live in a world for too long. So it reminds me of the Matrix, actually. You know, they're stuck in the Matrix, they don't even know they're in the Matrix, kind of thing. But yeah, then I guess that's the antidote, is when you're watching a sort of when you're watching something that is realistic like that based on real life, you actually can, like, you don't have to let it go. You can just chase it up and follow all these other leads, and it's like the Hydra head thing. Like, you chase down one little idea, and then it gives you 3 more, and then each one of those gives you 3 more different aspects and little wormholes to dive into and all that. It's fun. It's an interesting way to spend your time, and then at the end of it, you get to be the guy at the party who knows all the stuff and can sit there explaining it all.
I actually did watch The Irishman. I think that was the first thing I watched as part of this lockdown. So slow, like, oh my gosh, like, it's
a long movie. Yeah,
it's I don't really consume enough movies to really be like critical of movies. Like, I'm not that far and deep entrenched in it, so it's just like whether I like it or not, that's just how I base it on. And it's like, well, I for starters, I've got quite a decent knowledge of all of that stuff, so it's not like a educational tool for me, but it felt like it was a lot of old dudes making it. You know, it just didn't have the...
It was.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, well, certain things just go on and on and on. It's like, well, okay, like, whatever. Like, for what it was good in that sense. Like, if you do want to sit with those characters for a longer period of time, and if you do want to enjoy nothing really happening, that's cool. But yeah, it didn't really tickle my toes as a bunch of other shit has. Even from like just the interesting insights, like...
Did you watch it in one go, though?
Yeah. I think you have to.
You watched it all in one go?
Yeah.
But there's your problem. It's too long. You got to split it up.
I'm not going to watch half a movie and then watch the other half.
I think I watched it in 2 segments.
If I'm there to watch a movie, I'm there to watch a movie.
Well, you could even split it into 40-minute segments. It's long enough.
Well, do you go to a movie theater and go out for
I think part of the thing...
2 hours and then jump back in the movie theater? Like, you got to consume it how it's meant to be made.
Yeah, no, but...
How you got to consume it how it's meant to be.
Yeah, but it was... Yeah, it was released in movie theaters, but it was also released immediately on Netflix. So, I mean, I think it's given you enough license there. Like, that movie couldn't have been full. In fact, it was gonna be. Like, it was backed by Netflix in the end, but it was backed by, like, Paramount or something at first. And because he wanted to do all that anti-aging thing so he didn't have to cast different characters, which is, I mean, I got some thoughts on the anti-aging stuff. It's like, the actual technology of it was great. Like, I think it's as well as you can do that. But the physical acting doesn't stand up to, like, there's that bit where De Niro's character beats up the fella outside the deli, and it's so obviously a 75-year-old man kicking this guy. Like, he's meant to be 40 and in the prime of his physical life, and he's just not. Like, it's all the facial recognition stuff or whatever in the world doesn't hide up for the, like, physical. And then when he throws his gun off into the river and he's bouncing over the rocks, I'm just sitting there being like, "Don't fall, Bobby, don't fall." As opposed to seeing him as the Irishman. But yeah, I mean, they ran up the costs and it was going to be too long and it was too indulgent of a Scorsese project, so they got dumped by the studio, picked up by Netflix, which therefore allowed them to make a 3.5 hour long movie or whatever it was. So, I mean, I think we got some leeway on that matter. I don't think he'll be too upset by splitting it up, because I think it actually works better. Like, I'm not saying should have been a miniseries. I think it is what it is. In the words of Joe Pesci to Al Pacino in that movie, it is what it is. But, like, I just think it, on a personal level, I think it would have... I watched it in 2 segments. I watched half and then I watched another half. I think it might have even worked better watching it in sort of, like, quarters almost. Like, half those halves even more. And then it won't be so, like, overwhelmingly long. But I think the other thing with The Irishman is it wasn't really about Jimmy Hoffa and ultimately it became about, like, aging and mortality and facing up to the things that people have done in their life, and seeing these, like, ruthless criminals, or seeing De Niro being as a ruthless criminal. At the end of it, everyone else was dead, everyone he knew was dead, all his guys, they're gone, and then he's just this old man, like, dying in obscurity. And I think ultimately that was what the movie was about, so it was a bit of a different thing, but yeah, I don't know. I loved it, but I can see why others wouldn't, because it was long.
Yeah, so the thing about getting old and being alone, if you are lucky enough to be a survivor of all that stuff, I don't even think that's overly insightful. Like, that's part of every crime piece of art, that's part of every mafia piece of art, that's part of every cartel piece of art, movies, TV, whatever it is, there is that seed at the core of it. Like, so it's I don't find that insightful, and for me, it, like, there wasn't enough, like, mental stimulation to counteract the lack of action stimulation. So it's like, well, no matter how long it was, no matter how you want to consume it, it just wasn't good enough to be consumed. Like, if I viewed it in the segments, it wouldn't have felt any different, because it was just like, I think it's just the knowledge, the background knowledge one might have of those situations, because I think then you're getting into I can see why it would be enjoyable for some, because you're getting into that seed and that context of information around certain mafia situations, certain relationships between government and mafia, which is that's at the forefront of every single cartel mafia thing, and it wasn't really portrayed in a unique, exciting, overly entertaining, dramatic way. It was just like, they obviously wanted to do something, because they've all got certain histories. My movie knowledge isn't overly great, but they've all got certain histories in that genre, and it felt like they just wanted to do something to be able to do something, and not actually offer crazy new shit or just exciting shit. Like, it was just ultimately, I'm just saying I didn't like it, so.
I mean, we're gonna have to agree to disagree on that, because I thought it was a bit of a modern masterpiece. I can't remember if I had it as my favorite movie of last year or not. I don't know, but I think that bit about the histories is probably a pretty pertinent point, because I wonder if, like, I don't know, it sounds like you'd probably enjoy Goodfellas a lot more, and I suspect there's a fair bit of, like, because having seen, like, Goodfellas and the way it probably in a way glorifies that kind of thing, and then that was why the ending of Irishman kind of, like, rips all that away, which I don't know, I thought that was pretty unique to throw that extra bit in there.
Well,
it's The Sopranos didn't go on after that final scene, you know, like, they didn't show what happened to those guys 20 years later or anything.
But you see what happens to Tony Soprano throughout the process.
Oh no, that's a prequel movie that they're going to make, eh? Yeah.
So throughout those movies, those series, you're seeing the degeneration, if that's the right word, degenerative process,
yeah,
of the hero, of the main cast. So you're being told that, yeah, it's this is how it is, but if you want to be this person, you're going to have to accept a lot of heartbreak, a lot of pain, a lot of paranoia, a lot of anxiety. And that's part of all those shows, movies, and whatnot. So it's like, whether, like, The Irishman is about that. The Irishman points a gun at your face and like, that is how it is. Whereas a lot of the other series and shows, it's more of an underlying narrative throughout the whole whatever it is, that, you know, like, you don't need to really be told it's not going to be so good at the end, because you're seeing the arc, you're seeing the trend, and the trend is that throughout this, certain events are happening, there's certain mishaps, and I think it's like, I'm just thinking of the Narcos Mexico, where the guy, the Jefe de Jefe, he just spends a whole lot more time alone. He goes from being, like, it happens throughout the series where the bulk of the start stuff, he's around people. There's different people coming in and out. He's got to, talk to this person, talk to that person, and then that just transforms into there is no one around, there's one person he really talks to, and that's a process that happens beneath the surface, so you start to build up and understand, so if I want to be the jefe de jefes, maybe go about it in a better manner because this dude is just lonely and sad. So I think that captures me a bit more when that's part of the overall story, and there's, because any portrayal of these kind of figures, they never glorify it. They do glorify it in the sense that they show the good stuff that's happening. They show the woman, the money, the opulence, the power. All of that stuff is present. So they do glorify it, but it's present with a parallel narrative, a parallel story running alongside it. That is the complete opposite as well. And I think that's something that's at the forefront of a lot of those things. And while they don't glorify it, they do glorify it, but they also present it along with that idea that it never works out so well.
But usually it doesn't work out so well because the character dies at the end and they die in their prime, whereas if they hadn't died, they would just continue on doing what they're doing or whatever. As they say in The Wire over and over, it's all in the game. Whereas this dude in The Irishman outlived the game. Like, it's a kind of different... It's a similar theme, but it's a different take on the theme in a way that was kind of... I don't know, I thought it was more, like, stark and dramatic, just how, like, his daughter doesn't want to talk to him. He's isolated everybody. He knows the only people that he could talk to about this are all long dead now, and he's just, like, completely... A guy who had the, like... He wasn't the top boss or anything, but he was, like, an extremely powerful guy in his role as a hitman who had the air of these top bosses, and now he's entirely impotent, like, just sitting there lonely in his rest home room and talking to himself, and, like, I don't know. But we'll argue on this all day and not find the same, not find the, the middle ground. So, what else we got on the agenda today?
Yeah, I think that highlights our different personalities, because what you're telling me is that you enjoy hearing from the old dude, and
enjoy might not be the right word.
Well, you enjoyed the movie, so
yeah, okay.
Yeah, just for the basis of this summarization point, you enjoy hearing from the old dude. I enjoy more just knowing how the old dude ends up, and that's enough. Because either way, it still leads you to that point. I just don't want to watch a movie made by old dudes about old dudes reflecting on, whatever. Rightio.
On being
the
old dudes.
The only thing that's happening in the sports world right now, Wildcard, is some UFC matters, and I don't know, like it's been an interesting thing because throughout, I guess, the niche case journey, you have to... Well, I've found that managing my opinion has been an interesting process. So it's less about, like, in certain instances, it's about my opinion on a matter and sharing that opinion and making that known because I feel it needs to be known. In other matters, it's less about my opinion and just dealing with what is happening and rolling with it. So it's, in some cases, you just got to throw your opinion out the door and just deal with what is happening. The UFC is continuing to put on fights, and we don't need the full news breakdown. I'm sure if there are any UFC fans out there, they'll know, and that's Honkadori. Casual Kiwi sports fans don't need to know necessarily the immediate UFC stuff, which is they are putting on a new card, Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje. Khabib Nurmagomedov is in Russia at the moment, so that situation fell through. He was meant to fight Tony Ferguson, and wildcard, the funny thing there is that Khabib versus Tony Ferguson, I think this was the 5th time they have tried to schedule the fight, and then Corona came. So 4 times before, something had stopped the fight from happening in the lead up to the fight, and it was already viewed as being kind of cursed. This was the 5th time it had been, I think it was the 5th time, it had been scheduled, and then Corona comes along, and that fight is definitely cursed. It is the fight that UFC fans and fighting fans want to see, Khabib versus Tony Ferguson, but it's not going to happen, but it will happen, I'm sure, at some stage in the future. But what has happened for Kiwi sports fans is that the UFC is going to roll ahead, and they are doing so with the intention of just churning out fight cards, using their resources. They're talking about a casino on indigenous land in California, I think it is. There's also an island where they can put on fights. However they want to do it, whatever they're doing it, that's fine. Honkadori, good for them. And this is kind of the only newsy thing that's happening right now, is that if we do get a concentration of fight cards coming up over the next few months, there will be opportunities for the Kiwis to be involved. So Kiwis such as Israel Adesanya, Dan Hooker, Kai Kara France, Brad Riddell, Shane Young is also coming back from injury. They are all the dudes from City Kickboxing. And so there's an interesting situation where some of those dudes might be trying to fight. They all kind of were teeing up fights before the lockdown happened. So there were, like, Dan Hooker was teeing up a fight with Dustin Poirier, for example. And I think there were a few other ones lining up fights to happen at some stage this year, like in the first 6 months of this year. So they could definitely be involved in this kind of busier schedule that the UFC is trying to roll out. But then it's logistically how they go about that if they aren't allowed to leave New Zealand, for example. Training restrictions, we know the drill, everyone's talking about it, so we don't need to go in there. So it's just an interesting thing happening in the sports world from a Kiwi perspective, is that there are Kiwi UFC fighters who not need fights, but they will be wanting to fight as soon as possible to continue their progress and continue their rise. There are options available to them, and there's a willingness from the UFC to keep putting on fights. Just remains to be seen which dudes actually get booked for fights, the logistics around that, and what happens. So I'm going to write about that tomorrow, and it's just something, again, the UFC is the only competition that is really putting out all the stops to keep churning out the content that they want to. And we have Kiwis involved in that competition. So it's a little interesting little time for the UFC, and the Kiwi UFC matters, just dealing with where those dudes pop up, how they pop up, and who they are fighting as well.
So, like, the obvious question from that is, why are they still trying to put on cards at a time when every other sporting league is putting things on hiatus? And, like, also, are we talking, like, immediately? Are they looking to have fights coming up in the next couple weekends, or are we talking about, like, they're planning for maybe a month down the line when things can be, when I guess you can at least gamble on things being a little more, I don't know, open, I guess, globally. But even then, I don't know if that's a little too optimistic to think about. But yeah, those two questions.
So I think this card is for April 18th.
Right, week and a half.
So it's right around the corner. That's the opinion. That's the opinion stuff I started all with. Like, we've both probably got opinions on what should and shouldn't be happening, but I don't know. Like, the UFC just wants to keep going. They feel that they can do. Anyone who's involved in those fights, whether it's fighters, whether it's coaches, whether it's the UFC staff who are involved, they're doing it from their own free will. So there are rumors, like, if the UFC puts on X amount of events, their investment from Disney is paid in full, which I believe the number I saw was $750 million. So the UFC, if they just put on X a number of events, they get paid $750 million from Disney. So that might be a factor. The UFC are not a normal sports organization. Like, they're not they don't operate by the same rules and regulations and codes of conduct as normal organizations. They do whatever the fuck they want. So, and throughout the UFC's lifetime, they've done whatever the fuck they want as well. So it's part of their DNA to keep doing this. So, again, like, that's where I put my opinion aside and just deal with what is happening, and that's what's happening. So, but how it intersects with the availability of the Kiwi UFC fighters, that's a weird little piece of the puzzle. And they also have a fight, like, so compare the UFC to the NRL, for example. The UFC has very different resources to the NRL. So the UFC have their own performance center, which is their own ginormous facility where there's literally everything that a UFC fighter could ever need. That's there so they can put on events at that little center. They have the resources to control, not control in a bad sense, but you're not going to be able to put on fights at a casino on indigenous land with that casino fully open and any Joe Blow coming in. Like, I don't know for sure, but I think I'm saying that the UFC has enough resources, money to put up a deal with that casino and say, like, look, you're going to have all these fights, these are going to happen at this location, shut the shit down. That might happen, let alone investing in an actual island and flying fighters to those islands. So compared to the NRL is a fairly, as we explored at the start of this kind of whole situation, the NRL's resources aren't crash hot, and they're doing this from a place of desperation to help those resources. So one would assume that their possibilities and their options are limited. Like, people are getting quite excited about the NRL coming back at some point this year. I'll believe that when I see it, because all their plans are just like super funky I use funky as a positive all the time, but in this sense it just smells funky. Like, they're trying all these weird things just to keep it going, and that just smacks of desperation, whereas the UFC have the money, have the resources to literally make things happen. And they are desperate to make things happen, but they're not, like, they can make things happen with relative ease compared to the vibe I'm getting from the NRL. So, yeah, again, I don't really care for how or why the UFC are trooping on, but they are, and that's what we deal with.
And the obvious major difference between those two examples as well is that UFC is an individual sport as well, which drastically, like, to an enormous degree, limits the amount of people that are therefore going to be affected, potentially. Like, if you're talking about bubbles or whatever, like, every one of those NRL players, like, what do you got? 26 to 30 probably players in a squad. Every one of those players has families and friends and stuff like that. Like, the bubble gets pretty enormous pretty quickly. Whereas UFC, you can actually limit it a lot more. So I suppose if you got I don't know, there's always going to be some organizations that'll try to take advantage of a situation like this, and be like, well, if everyone else is shut down, we've kind of got the monopoly on viewership if we can keep going. Whether or not people will be interested is the other factor. I mean, people will be interested, obviously, from a diehard UFC perspective, but whether regular sports fans would actually be swung by that, I don't know, because I see a lot of, like, kind of almost apathy, I think, at the moment. Just a lot of people are not looking for something else to fill the void of the sport that's not there. They're just being like, well, these are extreme times, and we understand what's going on, and we'll just wait it out, sort of thing. I don't think a lot of people necessarily are of that mindset that they need something new to distract them with. So I don't know if that would work, but I mean, it doesn't have to if we're talking about, like, that thing about what's $750 million coming in from Disney or whatever. That speaks for itself, I suppose.
Yeah, but once again, we're just a couple of plebs talking about, like, what big organizations want to do, and at the end of the day, they do what they want to do, and they deal with the consequences. But it does roll into a question here. So we do want questions from our listeners, and we'll put that call out every time we put a Nichecast episode. We go to record an episode, so keep an eye on the Facebook and the Twitter. We'll put the call out for questions, and if you're listening to this, make sure you ask questions because it gives us something to talk about, and then you can kind of deal with us that way as well. On Twitter, we had a question from Jace Vanema, and he asked, who in the New Zealand sporting landscape is going to be impacted the most by the pandemic? Now, to kind of set the scene here, Wildcard, and answer this question, I think New Zealand is in a unique position where we've got so many, much of our sport is semi-pro, let alone amateur, and that is the highest level. Like, you're going to have rowers, cyclists, Olympic game, Commonwealth Games competitors who are amateur and rely on the generosity of the government. And something I heard last night actually was quite interesting. You should be your own government. Don't rely on the government. Be your own government, and, you know, be powerful within yourself so that you're not relying on the government, because as I've seen in Narcos, governments can be a bit shady. So there's all those athletes, and New Zealand's unique because we are the greatest sporting nation in the world, kg for kg, and that's only because of all those other sports that we cover and that we don't cover, who are of an amateur and semi-professional level, who don't make a lot of money but still compete at an incredibly high level on the international stage. That is the foundation of the sporting greatness in Aotearoa. So I think it goes without saying for that amateur and semi-pro level of Kiwi athlete, not the... It's funny because I just read this wildcard. I wrote about Corey Anderson and his like black caps and domestic cricket stuff of recent years. And then there was a comment from Ian West. Shout out to Ian West for leaving a comment there. He played 4 games for Parnell Cricket Club Prems through the season, got runs in 3 games and was back bowling by the end of it. Great guy, fitted in very well. So shout out to Ian West and shout out to Parnell Cricket Club in Auckland. But that's a club level, right? Like that's like, so when I'm talking about amateur and semi-pro, I'm not talking about the club level. I'm talking about the world-class athletes in New Zealand who are amateur and semi-pro by the fact that New Zealand is New Zealand and we don't have a lot of money, resources floating around. So for those Olympic, Commonwealth Games athletes, those kind of athletes who are who operate at a world-class level, however they are amateur or semi-pro, I think it goes without saying that they will be heavily impacted by this situation. Do you have any differing opinion on that little scene-setting exercise there, Wildcard?
Yeah, I thought about this a bit over the last sort of 24 hours since we got that one in, and I came to a pretty similar conclusion as you there, I think. Like, the what we're going to hear about mostly, and also when people talk about, I can't remember if the question was directed economically, I think it was just the actual effect, but normally what people, mostly what people are talking about with that is the economic impact, which is the obvious one, and when they talk about that, it's generally from a perspective of rugby, and if it's not rugby, it's probably still rugby, and if it's not that, then it's cricket and maybe netball and sports like that. I think those sports at the top level, though, like Super Rugby, will figure something out. Like
wait. Just wait. Stick to the. Do you have any of the semi-pro amateur?
Well, that's where I'm coming back to. Like, those top ones will figure things out because once they start playing again, sponsors come back, and I think the top of the tree tends to be taken care of. So I suspect, like, my...
See, that's where I disagree with that, but carry on.
Well,
I think that's where the funk is. That's where the true interest of this question is. But carry on
interesting
with the
then. Because I don't have a major, like, other than the existing problems that are already there in terms of, like, domestic cricket in New Zealand, for example, isn't particularly well funded. There's a New Zealand A tour coming up later in the year to, where was it? India, I think, which, I mean, if New Zealand cricket is stumbling for cash, they might be in trouble there. They're quite lucky, though, with the timing of this. Well, I mean, lucky is not the right word, but at least they are fortunate in that one aspect that they got through most of their season and most of their Black Cap stuff. Although, there was one 2020 series they didn't get to host as well. But for the most part, they did get through a pretty big summer. So that helps, whereas the rugby season was early on, so it was more affected. But, rugby will be fine ultimately. There will be sacrifices made by everyone involved, sure. But I fear for the level below that, which is the one you're talking about. I think already they've cancelled the, I don't know my rugby leagues well enough, I can't remember, but they've cancelled, it's either the top semi-pro thing, or it might be the highest one below that, I forget. But, there's things like that where it's not just the economic thing, there's also, a year of people's athletic lives that won't exist now, there's and this might even end up being the case in the NRL where they've got through 2 rounds, but I don't know, I figured they'll figure something out there. I'm not sure if that means merging seasons or whatever. The NBA's the interesting one here because they're the ones that are actually capable of taking the lead. They already have taken the lead on this, so how they address things and come up with weird novel solutions I think will be extremely impactful on how other sporting leagues around the world try to restart things and figure it out. But yeah, at a grassroots level, I just worry that there will be a lot of money, but there's only so much money to go around in terms of relief funds and stuff like that. So I really do worry about how well that cash will trickle down to those athletes who aren't making a full living of their sport. Many of them, this was going to be an Olympic year. There still will be the 2020 Olympics in 2021 for branding reasons. But, they still have that in the focus, but now they've had a disrupted thing of preparation and all that. I don't know, they're obviously, those athletes are a big worry, but the bright light of the Olympics at the end, at the end of the tunnel, I think does help things. If this was coming straight after the Olympics, I think you might end up seeing people forced into retirement or things like that sometimes. But even below that, my worry as well is just grassroots sports, not international athletes of any caliber, just regular old Joes. It's gonna be a weird one to figure out because there's no financial incentives to figure it out as well. They're not working for sponsors. They're just people playing for fun and whatever. And football season would have meant to have been starting very soon. Rugby the same, although winter sports are coming very close to when they would have been beginning, and in what shape or form they will happen this year is hard to say. And then what the fallout from that will be is also quite difficult because a lot of that stuff is built on volunteer work, and I don't know, it's a bit concerning, I'll say. That's one aspect which I don't know will get the recognition it should, because grassroots sport is the foundation of everything that comes above it. So that is a worry from my point of view, I think.
I have the complete opposite opinion. I think for the amateur and semi-pro athletes, that's where I started, but I do think a lot of those athletes, if you're a high performance athlete operating on a budget, you're incredibly creative and you're incredibly resourceful with what you have, and I think that presents them with a great opportunity to just keep doing what they're doing and keep surviving and flourish. It's nothing really new. If you're an athlete of that level, you're going to have to continue to be creative. You're going to have to continue being resourceful with what you do have, and that's all good. The grassroots sport, people are going to want to show up. They're going to want to show up and be around people, and when they can, I think you're going to see a resurgence because everyone's going to be eager to get back around. For many people around New Zealand, their sports club is their community. So I think a lot of people are going to rally, and it doesn't really matter if anything happens this year. There can be no grassroots sport, maybe a bit of cricket or summer activities at the end of this year, but the winter, say there's no winter sports, I think it's just going to ramp up people's desire and intensity to bounce back even stronger. And I think that's going to be the the resurgence. That's where I think it's going to be the most exciting. That's where it's going to be the most encouraging. Like, let alone the fact that many of these sports clubs are going to have to find other ways to be financially stable, because a lot of the grassroots clubs rely on, again, handouts. They rely on not the government specifically, but government organizations to give them money. They are not self-sufficient. They haven't found ways to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, grants and stuff as well, for sure.
Yeah, like, I mean, a lot of those clubs come from pokey money. Well, if people aren't playing the pokies, as terrible as it is, a lot of these sports clubs are going to fail. And I think that goes to a wider narrative here, where those who, as we've talked about before, those with unstable foundations are going to be shook up. And that's just part of life. That's part of the kind of competitive process, is if you're doing a shit job and something like this happens, then you're exposed. So I think the grassroots organizations, I think there's going to be, it starts from a personal level. So I think from a personal level, a lot of these people and these communities are going to be not desperate, but they're going to have a certain level of vigor at getting back into their club, getting back into their community, and expressing themselves through their sport and with their friends and family who are also part of those organizations. And I think that's going to spread throughout the grassroots levels to a bit of a resurgence. And I actually think, I think grassroots is going to be okay once this blows over, because that's where you're going to see, because all these bigger leagues are so self-indulgent that they think like even the UFC, whatever it is, the NRL, whatever league is trying to have some sort of relevancy at this time, they're doing so because they think like, we provide so much joy to people. Like the NRL thought they were the backbone of Australian culture. They thought, there can't be an Australia without the NRL. And it's like, okay, but I believe we're going to see that at the community level. So I think you're going to see that the real glue to the fabric of our society in New Zealand and our communities in New Zealand is at that grassroots level. And that's where it's going to be more of a case of like, our community needs the rugby club. Our community needs the cricket club. Our community needs the soccer club. So we're going to build it up because that's what our community needs. We don't necessarily need to be watching the NRL on TV. I get my joy from popping down to the club every Saturday, seeing my folks, watching a bit of sport and enjoying the atmosphere. That's what I need. And I'm thinking of, the smaller towns or just smaller organizations, as you highlighted there with I think the grassroots word is the key there. So I think people might actually find that their local sports club and their local sports community is far more impactful and influential than the higher leagues, but the higher leagues think they are so much more impactful and influential to the lower clubs, which is a interesting dynamic. I do have more thoughts on a couple of those bigger organizations, if you want to take a little interjection here.
Yeah, I'll just add in that in a funny way. I think you've kind of put my mind at ease there a bit, because like what I was talking about was that financial side of things and the grant money and the pokey money, that kind of thing. And I would be surprised if there aren't a lot of or at least a few sporting clubs who have been important backbones in their societies in their little communities rather, over the last, we could go back 100 years, who do fold or merge or have to take drastic measures in some way or another because of this. But I agree with your point about the people power though, and I think that sort of puts that thing at ease, because yeah, I mean, as Iggy Pop would put it, a lust for life, eh? Like afterwards, people are going to want to get out in societies and just like live it up, and that's a big part of it. Big part of the communal thing is the sporting, the local sporting scene, which has not been a big factor, maybe, or at least was a slipping factor, I think, maybe over the last couple decades, and we see this quite drastically, and I'm going to say these people are a significant part at fault for this as well, and how like the Herald and stuff keep just every time there's a cut, like there's people getting cut and made redundant or whatever, they're always picking on the like the local reporters and stuff like that because they don't speak to the bigger market or whatever, and local sport coverage tends to be one of the very first things they rip out, and I'm sure that's had an impact on the way that sports clubs have worked. But this could be an opportunity to bounce back better in a way we haven't seen for a long time. So you've put my mind at ease a bit on that matter.
And maybe that's a word of encouragement to those people who are involved at that grassroots level. Like, maybe I don't really want to be in a position of like offering advice and shit, because anyone who's involved will know better than me the hardships they are facing right now, because I'm not presently involved in grassroots sports. But that's the encouragement is to focus on what's right in front of you, focus on what's around you, focus on that level of sport. Like, don't look to the big bright lights for your enjoyment and your community. Look to down the road, look around the corner, look at the community that you're a part of, because that sports club is also going to provide like if there's someone in the club who needs support, that's where you're going to get your support from. If there are people who have enough to give to other people, that's the route they're going to use to give to people. That's the whole basis of a community. So in bouncing back from this kind of situation, that may be one of the best ways to do it, is to just amp up your local sports club, get around them, and just support them and support those within your community, because they are in danger, like, for sure, but it's also a fantastic opportunity just to double down on the community level, double down on the grassroots level, and shore up those foundations. To get back to the specific question, so maybe that's a positive impact. Do you agree there? Like, that might be a positive impact on grassroots sport.
Well, hopefully, yeah. Hopefully it will be. I mean, and they need it more, like, in terms of that support.
Yeah, so in answering the question, who have the most positive impact? This might be a contrarian answer, but the most positive impact might be to grassroots sport. Keep that in mind, and keep that in mind with your actions as well. Grassroots sport is only going to be hugely negative, have a huge negative impact on it if your actions are nil. But if your actions are based on, this is a great opportunity for grassroots sport, we're going to double down on grassroots sport, we're going to double down on our community, then it can have a positive impact. On a grander scale, I've got two kind of answers here for Wildcard that I'll be interested to get your thoughts and opinions on. Prior to this whole corona situation, I was paying loose attention to a situation with New Zealand rugby and a little bit of angst between the various players in rugby within New Zealand, not necessarily New Zealand rugby. You've got the kind of it's funny that we started this off with like crime discussion, because on the one hand you do have El Patron, which is New Zealand rugby, and then you've got the bosses of all the plazas, or the traffickers, and all the smaller folk around Aotearoa. And there's, again, I'm no rugby expert in New Zealand, but I do pay attention to the landscape, and it seemed like there was a bit of angst between those traffickers and those smaller players and the jefe of their community and all those people, and then the boss of the bosses, New Zealand rugby. So there was a bit of angst, and there was a bit of a situation brewing there, and New Zealand rugby has been riding the wave of immense financial growth and expansion. I mean, this is a very surface level note, but do you remember the whole kerfuffle around having a international corporation, like insurance, whatever, brand on the All Blacks jersey. The All Blacks jersey is sacred. You can't have that sponsor there on the front of the jersey. But the All Blacks, the brand of New Zealand rugby and the All Blacks, which, I'm flowing off the top of my dome here, wildcard, so just bear with me as I go deep here. New Zealand rugby put that brand on the front of their jersey because they had that opportunity. They had that possibility that was available to them based on the interest and power of their brand. Now, what they also did is they branded everything All Blacks. So you've got the All Blacks Sevens. You've got the Māori All Blacks. All the stuff has been branded with the All Blacks because New Zealand Rugby Union understood and understands the power of that brand in a corporate sense. Now, for the average Kiwi, for the average sports fan around the world, the All Blacks brand is so much deeper. It's a bastion of sports culture and how to operate oftentimes as a man, and culture in terms of Māori culture, because it's associated with the haka as well. But from a corporate sense, New Zealand Rugby was doing so well that they could see that there was another level. And the next level was, if we expand the All Blacks brand out to different teams and different avenues to ensure that that the All Blacks brand brings in that money, and then we leverage that brand to get more money. So I use that as a base for the argument that New Zealand Rugby has been doing very well, and they've been growing and growing and growing. Now, they've obviously been growing and growing and growing at the expense of the grassroots level in New Zealand, which is somewhat understandable considering the money's flown in at the top, and then we've got this at the grassroots level, like the playing numbers of clubs are down and all that stuff is down, and you might see clubs folding and stuff like that. So that led us to this point where there was a bit of a kickback from not a kickback because they're not getting any kickbacks really from New Zealand Rugby, but there was a pushback from the more provincial organisations against New Zealand Rugby literally weeks and months prior to the pandemic starting. So I think that might leave rugby in Aotearoa in a very interesting position. I don't want to say it's going to be good or bad. I just want to say it's interesting, and I think it's going to be. I think rugby in New Zealand is going to be the most impacted by the pandemic. I think that's like an overarching idea that will be interesting to observe and explore over the coming months. Perhaps the monopoly that rugby has in New Zealand might be impacted, or there might be, like a positive impact again. But then we have to also, I'm just thinking of the Wellington Phoenix, the New Zealand Warriors, the New Zealand Breakers who compete in Australia. Now, that's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Obviously, the Warriors may be involved at some level of some weird NRL competition that will be weird. But going forth, the Phoenix, I'm just assuming that there's not going to be any sport played in the near future. I'm praying from that base level. So the Phoenix might be involved in the A-League, whatever, who cares? But assuming that nothing happens for 4 to 5 months, I think those teams and those clubs might be impacted because they're at the mercy of any changes and developments to stuff that's happening in Australia. And just, again, thinking through this off the top of my head, like I'm pondering a future in which there's a greater emphasis on sports competitions within New Zealand, because when you're involved with a competition in Australia, like, there's going to be great positives, and that's fine, but it's also it's like a weak point. Like, if anything happens over there in Australia, it's going to have an impact on those teams from New Zealand, and you're relying on weird Australians to make right decisions, which there's not a great history of, for the well-being of your own team over here in New Zealand. So I'm interested to see how that dynamic might play out, and what any ramifications that might be for like sports leagues in New Zealand and how that might like shift the relevance and importance of those leagues. But I think any of those teams who compete overseas, primarily in Australian competitions, are going to be have their own kind of impact. But I think because of the context around what New Zealand rugby is dealing with their own little, it's not a huge drama, but it does appear to be a little bit of a drama. And then combined with the shifting landscape of New Zealand sport, I'm feeling like the rugby might be most impacted by the pandemic.
I was reading an article this morning by what's his name? Yuval Noah, however you say that dude's name, the guy who wrote that book Sapiens. He was writing, it was a couple weeks ago, I sort of bookmarked it to come back to when I finally got around to it. He was talking about like the way society can be changed kind of drastically by a big just happening like this. And he looked in a few different ways about, like, one of the things he talked about was technologies which otherwise would not, and he was talking about the way that government can use them in a sort of corrupt way, where like rush through surveillance technology with the idea of we're using it to detect this and solve this and whatever, but then at the end of it you come out and they're like, oh well, we'll just keep it around though, and now we know all these details about people and continue to monitor them sort of thing. Like technologies that will get like fast tracked and things like that, and like everything just apparently happens a lot quicker. And I suspect that, like, well, that's what I was thinking about when you're talking about the New Zealand rugby thing, because I suspect that was already, it was already in motion. You're saying the Grassroots, a lot of those clubs and whatever are already kicking up a bit of a fuss about the money not making its way down, which is always something that infuriates me, is the way like money just seems to, people just assume if there's lots at the top, it'll make its way down to the bottom, and for some reason there's just always these little hurdles and never quite gets to where it's supposed to be, and it all gets gobbled up at the top of the pyramid rather than making its way down below where it could impact more people, but whatever. So yeah, like I think that was already an element, and I think already there was aspects of rugby's shifting place in the culture where it's always going to be numero uno, but it's not necessarily going to be like miles ahead of everyone else to where it doesn't have to share. And I think that was already happening. And then based on that article that I read this morning, and based on what you were just saying there, I suspect we might be about to see just an acceleration of that whole process in a way which is going to be probably uncomfortable for New Zealand rugby, because in a situation that perhaps they were expecting, more likely I expect they were arrogant enough to think that it wouldn't matter and that things would always be golden, because we see that constantly from that whole like rich get richer kind of situation. And New Zealand rugby can't compete with the big sporting organizations around the world, but they do have a globally recognized brand in the All Blacks, and they are the big fish in a small pond in New Zealand. So yeah, I mean, it could be very interesting times in a way that I'm kind of excited to think about, actually. I certainly don't mind the old proverbial cat getting in amongst the pigeons in this situation.
Yeah, and that's I think, and just thinking about how like oh wow, this is like Corona heavy. It's but I think it's important. Where like, well, it's the only question we got, so it's led us down this path, which is kind of beautiful. There are a lot of like the stories of like how the coronavirus is gonna have a big impact on this shop down the road, and then this person can't do this, and then this company's got to lay off these people, and and this company thinks they're essential, but they're not essential, so they're going to run out of business. Like, to me, it's a very there's two quite clear paths you can take. You can take the path of like, this is going to have a very large negative impact on my business and or my sporting pursuits, or what I'm trying to do, or there is a far more like beneficial perspective and viewpoint and action plan, and that is that it's a time to change what you're doing, or it's a time to double down on what you're doing and just allow for those other structures to crumble away, and then you'll, by that force, you will be in a beneficial position. Like you can, because everyone's in the same boat once again. Like everyone's dealing with this shit. Everyone's dealing with losing money. Like that's what makes it weird when a lot of these big organizations are asking the government for assistance. Like, again, be your own government and maybe save some of your money, so when shit like this happens, you're not caught with your pants down. But what makes you so special that you go to the government when everyone else is in the same position? Everyone's in the same position, so it's like a leveling of the playing field to some extent. And then it's just up to you as a person, as a leader of an organization or whatever you are. It's up to you to do the best that you can in that situation. And I think for many of these organizations, for many people, for many athletes, whatever it is, it's about how are you going to operate now? How are you going to operate in, like, no one knows how we're going to emerge from this, so it's hard to like forecast, like, you know, like you can't make a plan like, okay, once the quarantine ends, I'm going to do this, and this, because fuck, definitely don't make plans in this kind of situation. Everything's changing all the time. However, you can view it as a beneficial circumstance for you, and that's what we talked about at the start of the lockdown, when we're talking about like how you can use it to benefit you as a person, your growth, your learning, investing in yourself, and stuff like that. It's relevant on a bigger level as well. Like, this might change how you do business. It might change your relationships with your business partners. It might change how you look at, getting income and being self-sufficient, because asking for donations, asking for grants, and asking for basically handouts, that's all good when everything's honkadory, when there's money flowing around, when we're dealing with like a positive universe, a positive world, everything was healthy in New Zealand before this. Everything was pretty damn healthy. There was a lot of construction going on. There was a lot of growth and opportunity, a lot of people coming to New Zealand to work and to spend money. And yeah, sure, of course, there's going to be pockets of New Zealand and communities that were struggling, as there always is. But on a general broad level, everything was fairly good in New Zealand for a while up to this point. And so that's when you get complacent and you just like start to go into handout mode, because there are people handing shit out and you don't have to do anything. Well, now you've got to do something. Now you've got to get creative. Now you have to find new ways of being a self-sustainable, self-sufficient entity, whether it's a business or your own person, in this landscape. And that, to tie it back to the question, that's how it's going to impact these sporting organizations. That's going to how it's going to impact you as a person. You're either going to be impacted by losing a shitload of money, losing your job, and everything hitting the fan, and struggling with that, or you're going to be impacted by some of those things happening and using it as a platform to leap into something else that you've always wanted to do, or to sharpen up your processes and operations so that you aren't so dependent on external factors. And it's just a fork in the road. You can either go down the negative route or the positive route, and that positive and negative in the sense that, like, okay, I'm going to attack this situation from a negative or a positive perspective, which is directly related to how it's going to impact you down the track. It's either going to have a positive or a negative impact on you. But I think the weirdest thing about this situation, Wildcard, is that you are in complete control of how it impacts you. You're not in control of like the shit that's taken away from you. You're not in control of the shit that you receive even. But you are in control of your mindset and what you're doing through this process, and what you do to emerge from this process. That's what you're in control of. And that's ultimately where you're going to be I don't know. I just kind of have this vision of being like jumping into a whirlpool and then being spat out the other side. Some people are going to be spat out into a beneficial situation, and some people are going to be spat out into a rather dire situation. But you have the power within yourself to dictate where you get spat out.
And the spitting out process was happening anyway. Like, it would have taken a lot longer. This is all a massively accelerated thing. It's all happening at once, which is why it's so kind of immense, the impact of it. But that, like, spitting out process was happening anyway. Businesses go under all the time, and it's kind of like a necessary evil of capitalism, which in itself is a unnecessarily evil, I'll say. But and I've got absolutely no dramas with the handout side of thing. It's just that the handouts have to go to the people and the places and the businesses that need them. And generally, there's like a stigma about that kind of thing as well, which I don't think is fair when you consider that a little over a decade ago, the World Banks got bailed out by governments and stuff all over the place. And it's like, well, at that point, surely the shackles are off. But I mean, yeah, that's another example of rich getting richer and like too big to fail and that kind of thing, which is why I don't have any sympathy for the people out there trying to chuck out arguments like, what about the economy though? What about the impact of the economy? And Helen Clark tweeted something that I saw this morning. Auntie Helen said, economies can recover, dead people can't. It's literally that simple. And at the end of it, we'll see what goes on. I mean, some businesses are going to fail. Some of them were failing already and have been pushed into that situation. I think of like Bauer Media, for example, ripping away all their Kiwi magazines and then having a big cry because they were deemed non-essential. It's like, well, you guys were already trying to sell the business. You didn't ask for any government assistance or anything like that. You gapped it as soon as you got the first opportunity to be able to blame someone else. And ultimately, Kiwi media is going to be in a better situation for it. I mean, I saw a dude, they interviewed a media analyst on the news, looked like he was going to cry. Like, why is everyone so upset about this? Like, they were a poorly run organization by an overseas conglomerate who had little interest in creating New Zealand for New Zealand prioritized content. The Listener, Women's Weekly, those magazines are massive brands that will be bought by someone else. I'm completely confident of this, and will be back in some form, probably much better because they'll be run more consistently by an organization that actually cares about what they're putting out there. So, obviously devastating for the writers and people who lost their jobs. Though this is something that's happening all over various industries all over the place. But yeah, I mean, the one aspect where this isn't something that you can just stand off and feel oh well, the machine keeps turning kind of thing about it, is with small businesses and sort of humble businesses that really do need that sort of foot traffic kind of thing. And I mean, there's something to do about that, though. That's an area where you can take things into your own matter. Like if the bookshop down the road sort of thing, the old indie store might be closing, or the record store or something like that. Well, support them. Like, spend your money there. Don't go to JB Hi-Fi or the Warehouse or wherever where they don't need it. Like, support small local businesses, and sweet as, you're doing your bit. Some will fail anyway. Most do, but it's important to have those things around. If you believe that, then put your money where your mouth is, sort of thing. It's easily done, and it's enough people do that, then it helps negate the negative effects. And it's all the same thing about making sure that money, but not just money, resource and interest and just I guess generally love, ends up in the places where it needs to be, rather than the places that try to thief and demand it and steal it from which is in itself, again, sort of a way of letting things affect positively rather than negatively, and being proactive, being positive, finding ways to make the best of a bad situation. That's similar to what you're getting at there, so we might as well all partake, right?
Yeah, and that's a nice little message to leave, as this episode we've mentioned the community and the grassroots a lot. So if there's anything you take away from this episode of the Niche Cast to ponder over the next few days before the next episode of the Niche Cast, it's about how impactful you can be at a community and grassroots level. Because that's the easiest way to have an impact and to have a positive influence on the world is just to put that positivity and generosity out into the world, and the easiest way to do that is with your community and your grassroots level, in this instance your local sports clubs, and that's the basis, that's the foundation and the basis of New Zealand. So by doing that, you're also strengthening New Zealand on a bigger level as well. So when we do get back to some semblance of normality, go down to your local little food joint, go down to your little sports club, get a beer, get a coffee, I hate sausage sizzles. Ugh.
Yeah, same. It's such a cliche.
Buy some food from your local sports thing and support them. And I'll finish with this, because having spent time in South America and Chile, to be precise, the kiwi sausage sizzle is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's not a good thing to eat for starters. So try something better if you are fundraising than fucking a sausage and some bread. Like, let's be a bit more creative anyway. Kia kaha.
Tomato sauce. It's literally the most basic thing imaginable, eh?
I don't know. Maybe it's got like the old marijuana and coca from the Central and South America. Bit of a high profit margin or whatever. I don't know. Fucking hell. Let's move on. Let's finish. Kia kaha. Stay beautiful, and we'll be back at some stage. Remember, any questions? Leave a comment to this episode, or just wait for the call for questions next week and ask us some questions, because it's stuff to talk about, and it lets us know what you guys are interested in as well. Kia kaha, stay beautiful. Chur.